Buenos días, buenas tardes.
Good morning or good afternoon, and a warm welcome to Looking to 2030, New Trends in Mobility. This is our third and last webinar as part of our transit-oriented development series in Latin America and the Caribbean. I coordinate the Cities Network at the IDB, and I'm pleased to introduce this webinar on challenges, recommendations for urban leaders, enhancing a territorial strategy, seeking to combine all of the components aimed at mobility systems for cities that are more environmentally friendly. Before we start, let me say that we have interpretation available into English, Spanish, and Portuguese. If you look at the lower part of the screen, you will find the globe icon for interpretation. And may I also remind you that you can send your questions to the panelists through the Q&A by using the Q&A button. And may I also remind you that we are recording the session, which will be available on the IDB YouTube channel as from next week. The link is available via the chat here, so you'll be able to watch that. We've already had 2 of these webinars, and this one is the third one. For those of you who are only just joining, the Cities Network of the IDB is a regional integration platform that seeks to facilitate the sharing of knowledge, solutions, and good practices among cities in Latin America and the Caribbean. Since the urban development field is multi-sectoral, we have interactions between the public, private, and academic sectors across over 250 member cities. And this also is intended to contribute to strengthening urban management leadership while promoting the development of capacities for the municipal and local government officials, while at the same time favoring synergies with partner institutions. And of course, you can use the link to register and get even more information. Before we kick off this webinar, I would just like to remind you that this is our third webinar. There are 2 previous ones available, which present all of the work we've done on transit-oriented development. The first webinar was on August 23rd, and we talked about the integration of urban planning and mobility, and we looked at Bordeaux and Guadalajara. That's available already, and there was another one on August the 30th, which discussed financing model challenges for TOD implementation. And again, we will work along similar lines with the food security series, and we'll have another one on climate action in LAC cities, and this will be starting as from this month. And if you'd also like to get the network's newsletter, that way we can send you all of the information for urban development, housing, and also the link is there. And having said that, let me move on to today's session. As we have been discussing, transit-oriented development through a territorial strategy based on urban projects seeks to articulate urban components such as land use and occupancy, the distribution of public spaces, and the promotion of economic activities in combination with mobility systems, encouraging business, services, and other essential facilities near the transport corridors. The process has been influenced by major changes in travel and commute, as well as land use patterns. In recent years, this has led to a reduction in demand and in public transport revenue. And these changes are relevant to the current policy and the implementation of transport policies generally. So what is the impact of reduction demand in public transport, and what is expected of the public policy framework going forward? During this session, we'll be dealing with and discussing Santiago, London, Sao Paulo, and Buenos Aires, and how they have faced these changes in travel patterns in recent times, in addition to the challenges and opportunities they have identified. We will also explore the trends in mobility, and we will also look at changes in land use patterns with a focus on alternatives to promote more resilient cities. So we will first have two presentations dealing with the changes in commute trends in Santiago in Chile and London in the UK, followed by a discussion among the secretaries of urban planning and licensing of Sao Paulo and the undersecretary of mobility planning of Buenos Aires. After that, we will have a Q&A session. And today, we are pleased to have Agustina Calatayud with us. She heads the Transport Division Research Section at the IDB, and she will be moderating. And we will also have a presentation by Ricardo Hurtubia, an associate professor at the Pontificia University in Chile. And we have Martin Taylor, who is the head of the business strategy at Transport for London. In the second part of our discussion, we'll be dealing with some key issues regarding the future of urban planning and mobility, and we will have Buenos Aires and Sao Paulo there. And we will also have José Armenio de Brito Cruz from the licensing and urban planning department of Sao Paulo. And we'll also have Lucia Capelli, who works for the Undersecretary of Mobility Planning of Buenos Aires. We look forward to a very lively discussion today. And before we start, and to help our panelists and to make sure that we all know who's in the audience, I would like to ask you to kindly remember the Mentimeter here that will be operating in real time. You can let us know what sector you come from. Is it the public sector, local, federal, national, private sector, civil society, academia, or some kind of international organization or NGO? So here's the Mentimeter, and you can scan the QR code, and hopefully we'll be able to collect information on you and on our audience.
Sector público va ganando, sector
So
privado.
academia, public sector seems to be winning, private sector. I think we can say that these questions are focused on helping us design a series on the topics that have raised particular interest. It would help us to know what city or country you live in. That can also help us understand your needs. And here's the next Mentimeter. You can actually write what city you come from, city, country you choose. So, before giving the floor to Agustina and kicking off this interesting discussion today, it would be good to understand the mobility trends that have become particularly prominent in your cities. Have there been changes in trends, for example, in terms of home location? What are the main trends you have identified in your cities? Are you aware of those? Are you familiar with them? There may be trends in terms of the location of homes or business or offices. Has active mobility increased? Has the use of public transport decreased? Are there more motorbikes? This is another trend we have got to see. What has been the main trend in mobility in your city? This is what this is about. Well, increase in cars and motorbikes. So I think, Agustina, that's a good start to this discussion. So without further preamble, I'll give you Agustina, who will be with us throughout the session. Agustina, the floor is yours, and thank you for joining us. Thank you, Maria Camila. It is indeed a pleasure to be with you. And we thank our colleagues from the Urban Development and Housing Division for the participation in this series of webinars as part of this huge network, also with the Sustainable Mobility Forum. Greetings from Bogota, Colombia. I have seen there are lots of people connected with us, and I'm originally from Argentina, so greetings to my fellow country people who are already connected. Maria Camila talked about the importance of this comprehensive approach to transport and urban development. And the agreement between the IDB and World Bank recently invited us to join forces to achieve development goals on the basis of common and coordinated work. So this ties in with our meeting today. It's very important for public policy not to be by means of silos or uncoordinated areas. So this is where transit and urban development must work hand in hand to come up with solutions that can address the huge quality of life development challenges faced by city dwellers. And of course, the development of transit is very important, and it leads us to plan our cities on a multi-sectoral basis. Maria Camila talked about the main focus of this webinar on the transport side. This very much goes in line with what you said in your answers. We are concerned about the trends in urban mobility, the lower demand for public transport, but there's also a glimmer of hope. We see more active mobility, rising the use of bicycles, or even people walking. In Colombia, it's amazing to see how much more people are using the bikes, and this is a trend that remains after the pandemic. There's also an increase in the use of private vehicles, whether they be cars or motorbikes, which has also led us to follow with concern the increased congestion levels. So we would like to explore these trends with our guests, Ricardo Urtubia and Martin Taylor, to kick off this session and then move on to a discussion with our policymakers, Lucia Capelli and Jose Armenio Brito de Cruz. So with that, I would like to kindly ask Ricardo to offer us his presentation so we can hear about the new trends, what impacts they have, both in terms of mobility as well as with regard to urban development. Ricardo, warm welcome, and the floor is yours. Thank you, Agustina. I hope you can see the slides well. Yes. Good morning. I'm Ricardo Urtubia. I'm a professor at the Catholic University of Chile. I work at the Transport and Logistics Department, and my area of research is active mobility and urban location models, seeking to understand decisions on location and thereby the increase in city sizes, the growth in cities. And of course, another area is sustainable mobility. So I will briefly tell you about changes in mobility and location patterns we have seen recently. And I will talk about COVID, a disruptive event, and will also refer to the social upheaval in Chile, which happened shortly before COVID. And I will present the result of some research done with a group of colleagues, and this deals with the housing deficit and how the deficit can be harnessed to come up with better proposals for sustainable mobility and better patterns of use. So I'll talk about the changes. In October of 2019 in Chile, and especially in Santiago, we had a significant increase in the price of public transport, which triggered protests that had never before been seen in Chile. So some metro stations were set on fire. There were large-scale demonstrations in the city, especially in the downtown area, but all over the city, actually. And this obviously greatly disrupted the transport system, and particularly the public transport system and the metro network. Now, I would like to highlight this bit of information from a doctoral student whose dissertation had involved a survey. And when this all came to happen, we said, let's try the survey again and see what changes in mobility patterns have taken place. And what we found is that, of course, the subway and metro disruption led to a significant decrease in the use of metro. So at the same time, we saw an increase in the use of bicycles. So that was sort of the glass half full against the background of the negative effects of destruction in metro stations. We still had that positive effect. And at the same time, we saw an increase in the use of cars as well. So the pattern shifted from the use of significant public transport use to more private transport use. So people used the public transport system in the past and then shifted to private. This was a little while before COVID. And then with COVID, this is another study we did. In the first week of the pandemic, we surveyed people and we looked at their patterns before and after the pandemic. So everything went down, but especially public transport. The smallest decrease was in the use of cars and private modes of transport, such as taxis, motorbikes, and such like. And we also see a significant decrease in the use of bicycles there. So there was a trend from public to private modes. And of course, we are looking at motor vehicle use going up in some cases, and also the use of bicycles. An interesting development during the pandemic was the increase in teleworking. And one of the first things we identified, this is no big news, we found that telework is greatly related to people's income levels. Those who can benefit from teleworking, and of course, in the case of COVID, we had the higher income segments that could make the most of this option. And this provides some background to figure out what the urban relocation patterns will be in the face of the possibilities of working like this even after the pandemic. And there are certain studies, in fact, here you have an example of one of our studies, but there have been several studies in the recent literature which point out to the fact that one of the main changes, in addition to the changes in mobility as a result of COVID, we see a link to changes in location patterns. There is an increase in people living on the periphery. There is an increase in migration from large to small cities. This is something we have seen around the world. We have found this in many pieces of research, and we can see that urban sprawl and the transformation in city centers are very prominent features triggered by COVID, and the changes will become all the more apparent in the medium and short term as well. And here on telework, we looked at the probability of someone doing telework, and we had the option to continue working as always, or doing telework or doing nothing. And if we look at the final three lines, we found that people generally, the further away they lived from the workplace, the less likely they were to work, except if they were drivers, car drivers, or cyclists, which obviously changed the options. And so we found that people who couldn't telework were perhaps more forced to stay in an urban setting, whereas those who could drive were basically distance indifferent, and they might even be encouraged to move to more peripheral areas. And we have seen this happening in Santiago. There is a significant increase in the number of people going to more peripheral areas. And this has happened among high income segments, but also with the increase in access to cars, we have seen an increase in middle and even lower middle income segments. This is bad news for cities because large areas in the city have grown in an unplanned fashion, and there's not necessarily the right public transport. In fact, we have the Ampa area in the north of Santiago with middle income homes and some people living in informal or more informal settlements. And this was well documented even before the pandemic. This creates financial and time stress because obviously the people who have to start using their car uh, end up leading to higher emission levels. And of course, there's a social problem attached to that too, in terms of the money they need to spend. And another important problem we have identified has to do not just with the expansion of cities, but also there's the migration from larger to smaller cities, which had this idyllic setting until not so long ago. Now they have grown a lot. And the thing is the way they have grown, because these cities haven't just seen an increase in their internal population, but there's the agricultural or farming areas, and we see there has been significant growth in the smaller cities with very low density, and all of the people that moved from Santiago to these areas, they still keep their jobs in Santiago, so they do telework and every now and then commute between the new cities they live in and Santiago. And there are also areas which are sort of more rural, but these people have to use their car. One example is Pucón. This is a well-known tourist destination, one of the main ones in Chile, even for international tourists, not just Chileans. And what is marked here in red is the growth in the real estate market for residential property. And you will see that this is a little bit hard to quantify, but we see many homes in very low density areas expanding across the territory. And of course, there's no public transport here. These are rural lanes and roads. So, there are even dirt roads in order to get to these areas, which means that the spatial distribution of travel needs is unsustainable. And if you look at the location of the houses, if you assume that they commute at least once a day, and again, focusing on Pucón, there's 82,150 kilometers on average, and there's a significant level of emissions, 41 tons a day in CO2 emissions. And Pucón is supposed to be a very ecological, environmentally friendly area. And there's 1.8 kilos of CO2 emissions per capita every day. So we see a rising trend and problem in this regard. And of course, the downtown urban central areas are starting to look emptier and emptier because we have more unused empty offices. And there's a study dating back to 2015 that looks at the possibility of retrofitting and converting these now empty spaces. All of this by way of background. And in just 3 minutes, I will present a study by Nicolás Valenzuela Levy. I also co-authored it along with Juan Carlos Muñoz, our incumbent Ministry of Transport. And as part of the study, against the backdrop of COVID and considering the need, because after all, COVID was a situation that led to a significant decrease in the use of public transport. People were afraid of becoming infected, and this meant that cycling became a very appealing mode of transport. This picture was taken during the pandemic. There was a significant increase in bicycle use during the pandemic. And of course, this context of lockdowns meant that people interacted less, and having areas in which people are better positioned to use their bikes leads not just to more sustainability, but to greater resilience too, because you can deal with situations such as COVID in a better way. And people who lived in cyclable or within cyclable distances were better able to face the mobility problems that ensued. On this map, you will see the housing deficit measured by reference to families that live in overcrowded conditions or who live in poor housing conditions due to construction issues or people living in slums. Basically, we are talking about precarious housing, informally occupied land, and illegal land occupancy situations.
This is important because there are 400,000, 500,000 houses that are lacking, and where the blue is darker, that is where the greatest lack of housing exists. So these are families that live in that situation of housing deficit. So these families, here we looked at workplace accessibility, and what we found was that the center of Santiago had high accessibility. So we said, okay, if we are able to relocate these families, if we move them closer to the city center, we will give them good access to jobs. So we ran 3 different scenarios. Ricardo, I'm going to have to play my role as moderator and ask you to please wrap up. I'm sorry, I thought I had 15 minutes. Okay, it will take me 2 more minutes. So we had 3 scenarios, one very centralized where we move people towards the center of the city, another scenario less ideal called in situ, and the other we called business as usual. So what we did was we look at the length of travel and where people are located. This is precarious housing sites. And what we see is that the current situation is not the best one, because people are living where it is most convenient for them. And that makes us think 61% of the people, the best possible scenario was different than the compact, which was 45%. So here I'm about to conclude. So the trend to urban expansion, migration, emptying out of non-residential buildings is something we see in the urban centers. Also, the spontaneous location of households occurs in areas where there is a housing deficit, in areas where there is high accessibility, and where there's potential for active mobility. The idea is to balance the density so as to provide for more compact cities. Now, what do we have to look at here? Cost benefits. We have to look at the cost benefits. The costs were not identified by the study. And also we have to look at the impact of public policy. What are the necessary incentives to exploit this potential? And here I wanted to share an idea with you. Nowadays, living in the center of Santiago or in the periphery doesn't take into account the externalities that are created having to do with mobility. So if we were to charge a Pigovian tax, that would create an incentive in terms of a more centric localization, and it would allow for greater densification and better land use. But of course, this is the ideal, and I'm just throwing out this idea very lightly, but that is our potential direction for the future. Thank you. Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you very much. That was a great presentation. Many of our ideas are reflected in the trends that you presented, the problems having to do with this expansion, where cities are expanding to the periphery, and that is affecting transportation. And I see that there is a lot of chat in our chat, so I will be saving some of those questions for our Q&A. In the meantime, I wanted to recognize Martin. Martin is going to be speaking English, and so I remind you that we do have interpretation into Spanish. Martin, it is a pleasure to have you with us. We are looking forward to hearing about your experience in London, and what better than to hear from you with Transport for London. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Augustina. Very delighted to be here. So I'm going to talk to you about a metro extension that was recently constructed and opened in London, and through looking at that, see what lessons we have, not just for transport orientated development, but also the lessons of the pandemic, building on the really interesting evidence we just heard from Santiago. So to start with, London has a something called the London Plan, which is our overall spatial development strategy and describes where the city needs to go in terms of economy, society, transport, and environment. That was published in an updated form in 2021, but really as a document was developed and the evidence base exists before the pandemic. Underneath the London Plan sits a variety of thematic documents, one of which is the Mayor's Transport Strategy, which sets out, as I say, the transport element of how London has to develop. And that's what Transport for London, my organisation, is responsible for delivering. And it has an overall aim of delivering 80% sustainable mode share, public transport, walking, cycling. And we'll see later how that's developed since the pandemic. The London Plan and the Transport Strategy identify a series of opportunity areas within the city. You can see them in pink on this map. They are areas where there is significant development, opportunity and capacity, which is measured either in jobs, where there needs to be at least 5,000 jobs within one of those areas, or homes. One of those areas of opportunity is just south of the River Thames, called Vauxhall, Battersea, and Nine Elms, and it's one of the bigger opportunity areas in the very centre of the city, which has been affected differently by the pandemic. So our analysis suggested that there are nearly 20,000 homes and 20,000 jobs that could be generated if we develop this area correctly. And transport is really critical to how that happens. So we look at this bird's eye view of the same map. You can see the River Thames running through the centre of the picture. This shows, before the extension, the public transport accessibility level. Here, the sort of shade of blue is is bad, there isn't good accessibility, and the shade of red at the very top of that area is better connected because it's close to Vauxhall, which is a metro station on the Victoria line. So the problem here was that development was constricted by the fact that there was poor public transport accessibility, and you can see the roads going through that area, but no real good connectivity. So the solution developed nearly 15 years ago now, were these two new stations on the Northern Line of the London Underground at Battersea Station and at Nine Elms. And the timeline for how that came together, that opportunity area was first identified in 2004. The power station itself, which has been derelict for some time, was bought by a property developer in 2006. And they started to understand that for their development to be a success, significant new transport was required. So they actually developed the scheme in outline that we just saw and lobbied for it successfully, such that by 2010, it formally became something supported by the mayor and through the transport strategy itself. It required an innovative approach to funding, including something called an enterprise zone, which I'll talk about briefly later. A new developer took over the main site in 2012, which, when it comes to transport-orientated development, happens a lot. It can't just be one company and one developer. Often the proposal needs to be robust to changes in the private sector. And that scheme was developed such that in 2014, it received government approval, and TfL was able to enter into contracts and start some of the enabling works. The tunnels for the new metro line and stations were bored in 2017, and then it opened with a slight delay due to the pandemic in 2021. So if we go back to this map with this shade of blue, meaning poor connectivity, once the extension opened, you can see immediately a very high level of public transport accessibility. So really transforming the area and making it capable of being developed. And again, if we go back to this timeline, so this exact same timeline we were just looking at, and then overlay housing growth on top, you can see a really good correlation. So ever since it was an opportunity area, there has been a low level of new homes built within that boundary. It's still in the centre of London. You know, it wasn't a complete wasteland, so you had some housing development. But after it became sort of an approved scheme and something backed by the mayor with a clear funding path, you started to get homes. And as that project became more and more certain of being delivered, you can see that delivery rate really increases, and we expect that to continue out into the 2030s. In terms of how the project was funded, I know you've touched on this in the first two webinars. The scheme costs about £1 billion in GB sterling. That was entirely borrowed by the local authority within London. And the reason it could borrow that money is it knew exactly how it was going to pay it back. And largely entirely through developer contributions in two forms. So there were 270 million, so just over 25% of the cost came directly from upfront through really big developments on site. So the power station just on the river is the biggest of those. So they contributed about 200 million, about 20% of the cost of the scheme. So that was upfront contributions to really help get the project going. And then the rest will be collected over a period of the next few decades through incremental business taxes. So I referred to an enterprise zone earlier on, and that was a boundary drawn with the approval of central government that said businesses will benefit within that area from this scheme being delivered, and therefore added a small increment, a small percentage on top of their business rates, their business taxes that they have to pay for a period of time. So entirely funded by the development, both through those upfront developer contributions and then the incremental business taxes for the coming decades from all businesses in the area that benefit. If we look at some of the context, especially since the pandemic, this is absolutely required. London needs more homes. It has a target of 42,000 net additional or new homes a year, and it has got nowhere near achieving that in the past few years, achieving maybe 75% in individual years. We also know, and this builds on the sort of the Santiago perspective we just heard, that trends in trips since the pandemic have been quite different. So commuter services and commuter journeys have come back less strongly. So what you're looking at here is on the left-hand side, the percentage of journeys taken at stations that have a commuter bias, a leisure bias, or those of a mixed purpose. And leisure has come back much more strongly in London than commuter journeys. So it's clear that just relying on classic radial rail services, bringing people into dense sort of city centres, driving agglomeration, isn't the only thing that will drive transport or transport-oriented development in future. But we can also see on the right-hand side there that while the commuter recovery has been slowest overall since before the pandemic, it is in more recent times growing quicker year on year than leisure trips. So that context really suggests that we can't just focus on one type of journey or another. So I will end on a couple of lessons for the future from the Northern Line extension, both for how we deal coming out of the pandemic, but also how we deal with transit-orientated development. So this chart doesn't have a label, apologies, but it shows the monthly trips of people using the new Battersea Power Station, the new metro station within this opportunity area. Crucially, you can see when it's opened in September, October 2021, you immediately get a spike in demand as the service wasn't there before, and it's now open, followed by a gentle increase, because we can see in that area that you have pandemic recovery, but you also have new homes going up all the time and new offices being built. And then you get this big spike in October 2022 when that landmark marquee development of the power station opens. And crucially, that site is a mixed use site. So it has offices, it has retail, and it has residential, which really helps make the development more robust to different trends in mobility and different types of impact on the economy and society, because it isn't just reliant on one type of trip. It also means that what's been created in that area of London is a very modern, sort of sustainable area. So walking is easier, cycling is easier. There is cycle parking, there is cycle hire, there is access to river services, and there's much less car parking available, which means it plays into something we've seen in London, which is that trip lengths on average have come down significantly. So people are more willing to make more local journeys as they do some of that home working that we heard about in Santiago. Their trip patterns have changed. And so this area around the Northern Line extension really allows people to live in a way that they seem to want to since the pandemic, but crucially in the very middle of the city, rather than having to go to the smaller towns that we heard about earlier. And the last thing I would say on lessons for the future is we know that in many cities there is lower demand for public transport, even if it's recovered to 100% of the pre-pandemic levels. It's not where we expected it to be, given projected growth rates. We know also, especially in the UK, that economic growth is slower than we would like, but we still want to make these improvements. So one of the ways that London has potentially shifted its focus is, before the pandemic, we were looking at the next project being a really big project. So something called Crossrail 2, a big underground, mainline sized new rail connection right across the city from south to north. But the cost of that at 40 billion now just looks unachievable. Whereas when we look at the Northern Line extension, which cost just 1 billion, in London, that feels like a achievable size of project that we know we can deliver by putting in some of our own operating surplus and combining it with developer contributions or central government funding available for unlocking homes. We can create a package of funding that can unlock transit-oriented development, unlock new housing and growth, and that feels like an appropriate size of project as we come out the pandemic. So we've had to change our ambition level somewhat, but we're still achieving the same outcomes, just at a slightly different pace and a slightly different scale. So that's the summary of the situation in London as told through the eyes of this particular rail extension. And you can see a couple of the pictures of the new stations here. Thank you very much, Agustina. I'll pass back to you.
Thank you, Martin. That was a really interesting presentation. Voy a cambiar ahora en español para nuestros oyentes en
I'm
español.
going to speak Spanish now because that is the language of most of our audience, but it's great to hear the experiences that we have from the other side of the Atlantic. That too is a great example of what can be done with transit-oriented development. There's a lot of discussion in the chat, so please don't leave because we do want to answer your question, and that will happen after the exchange that we have now. We are going to hear from Lucia Capelli, and also Lucia is from Buenos Aires, and Jose Armenio Brito Cruz is the Undersecretary of the Municipal Department of Urban Development and Licensing in Sao Paulo. So we're glad to have you with us today, and I wanted to begin this conversation with our policymakers with a question for both of them. We have seen, you have seen it in your own cities, you have seen that cities have changed. Mobility is following different trends. Mobility has changed, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. And we would like to know specifically in the case of Buenos Aires and Sao Paulo, what are you seeing? Ricardo talked about Santiago in Chile, but what are you seeing in terms of changes in mobility, and what has the impact been on cities or urban development? So, Lucila, we begin with you. Hello. Hello, I hope that you can hear me well. If not, please let me know. As always happens, the truth is there's a close relationship between what is happening in Chile, in London, and here in Buenos Aires after the pandemic. And first of all, I should say we have 3 million people that live in Buenos Aires, and that is where we work with the government as part of the city, but the metropolitan area has 15 million people. So we cannot separate the city out. It is part of that metropolis. So I will be talking about the metropolitan area too. We have a transportation infrastructure that varies. We do have underground networks. And what we're seeing is that there has been a drop in demand for public transportation during the pandemic, but now we have recovered 100% of the demand. This has to do with the number of users, but in terms of networks, there has been a loss of 30% of the demand. That may be a permanent loss. It is something that we have seen over recent years. We're working to recover the passengers, but it also has to do with the economic wherewithal of the users. We see that the center of the city, I can hear you. No, there is a message saying that we're not hearing you clearly. Yes, there's a network towards the center of the city. So people go from where they live to where they work. And so that is for the financial center, for services, also for educational use. So that usage was intensive. Metropolitan trains, depending on the line, have the same passenger rates, especially the northern line to the metropolitan center. There we have poor statistics because there are high evasion levels, which makes it hard to reach clear conclusions. But it's clear that public transportation was affected by the pandemic. But in 2023, we see that usage is close to before the pandemic. Then we have individual motorized travel. That is something that concerns us. We have 15% increase in the number of cars driving downtown Buenos Aires. We have 15% greater revenue, and the number of motorbikes is an urban phenomenon in the metropolitan center in Buenos Aires. Now, more motorbikes are being sold than the number of cars. And in the last 4 years, the percentage has changed. So now more motorcycles are sold than cars for different reasons. First of all, because of macroeconomic considerations, but also motorbike riders are efficient, but they also affect our accident rates on our roads. Motorbike uses increased during the pandemic, and for us as policymakers, this is a challenge. It is efficient, but it also affects our road safety statistics. Then we had 24% increase in the use of bicycles during the pandemic, and 1 of every 10 trips on bicycles. Those numbers have gone back to pre-pandemic levels, but bicycles are still used for daily trips in the city. The increase has been marginal, the volume has been maintained, but it hasn't been possible to maintain the number of bicycle trips. We see that many bicycle trips were related to, or were people that had before taken public transportation. So they've now gone back to public transportation. We see greater movement in neighborhoods. That has decentralized the city somewhat. We also look at the degree of tree coverage, which is important for environmental reasons. So that was what I wanted to contribute to this conversation with our colleagues. Also, here we see that this has affected the social structure of our cities, and the cities have many things in common. And we see that the pandemic left some good things behind, but also some challenges.
Excelente. Lucila, ¿me escuchan, verdad?
Thank you, Lucila. You can hear me, right? That was excellent.
Lucila, qué buen análisis nos has hecho.
Lucila, that was a great analysis. You talked about the bright spots, the dark spots that come post-pandemic, and I see that we see similar patterns across the region, even in cities that are smaller than Buenos Aires. Now, I wanted to call on Jose. I wanted Jose to tell us if those bright spots, the dark spots that we see in different areas in the hemisphere are being seen in your city too. So go ahead, Jose.
I will try in English. I don't speak Spanish.
Pero puedes hablar en portugués, porque también tenemos, y les aprovecho para decirle
But feel free to speak Portuguese if you feel like it. For the benefit of the audience, there's also Portuguese translation available.
First, I would like to apologize for my delay. I had some technical problems, but I managed to hear Ricardo, Martin. I heard their presentations as well as Lucila. I think that both presentations, Martin's and then Ricardo's, in reality, give us the reason why I'm here. I am the Undersecretary for Urban Development, and I'm here participating on a discussion on mobility. I want to talk about the importance of the change of perspective, because mobility has to be seen, as Martin said in his presentation, looking at opportunity regions in the city. That is to say, where's demand for mobility? This is directly linked to urban planning.
So we nowadays understand that mobility doesn't always just meet demand, but it will generate demands also. With urban planning and mobility taken together into consideration, we see that housing and employment will generate demand for mobility. I say that as a way of saying thank you to Ricardo, Martin, and Lucila, because this will help me take into consideration all the things that were discussed about the COVID pandemic, considering urban planning, mobility, focusing urban planning regarding what we are currently doing in Sao Paulo, in the city of Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo had a master plan that was approved in 2014, and one of the views and premises for this master plan was to bring housing closer to jobs. And when our government, since 2017, had the job to implement these premises that brought close housing to jobs. When this was happening, we were hit by the COVID pandemic that totally changed the scenario in certain aspects, but in other ways, it made some things even more evident. As far as São Paulo is concerned, and Lucila has talked a little bit about that regarding Latin American cities, we have a lack of housing. There are different criteria to scale this lack of housing, but as Martin said, 42,000 per year in London, we have a deficit of housing for about 600 million people. I usually say that this is just trying to do something that takes you nowhere. We have built 45,000 of social housing units, but this is very little in terms of the number of people who need to be covered. Therefore, the guidelines in urban planning to bring closer housing and jobs are essential for us. I can give you an example, which is revitalizing the city center in the city of Sao Paulo. This is preparing the center of Sao Paulo to house 200,000 people, give or take. This is essential for Sao Paulo because these are 200,000 people who take nowadays about 3 hours to arrive at their jobs and who will be living right next to where they work. We have surveyed the number of jobs that are generated for the people who live in the center of Sao Paulo. So in this area where we have jobs, infrastructure that are very abundant, with good jobs, infrastructure in terms of numbers, this means about 2.7 jobs per person, actually. So the people who leave the areas, the peripheral areas, the urban sprawls, they arrive in the center of Sao Paulo. In the area where they live, there is a 0.3 job available for a person. So this is why it's so important to revitalize the center of Sao Paulo for cultural reasons, for economic reasons, but also because there's a social importance where we find a way to change the trend of this erratic urban development. So we're preparing the city center for all of these people with an internal mobility project that is being aided by IDB, and we're going to implement the last miles of a mobility that will hit the last mile of the transportation that will qualify what we consider the urban intervention area in the city of São Paulo, with a line of light vehicle on tracks like a train or a tram. This project will allow us to cover about 10 kilometers in a kind of a round circular manner that will bring people closer to the jobs regarding their housing. And there are other projects that are being taken into consideration in São Paulo for the urban interventions we're taking into account. But you know that São Paulo is very large. There are 12 million people, and with this underestimated deficit, the speaker is correcting himself. It's not 600 million, it's 600,000. That's the bottom line for our deficit in São Paulo, 600,000 people, as has corrected the speaker. So our intervention in the historic center of São Paulo and the surrounding areas is essential for the city because it changes the urban development logics making it more sustainable, reducing CO2 emissions, increasing active mobility, and unload the demand on collective transportation, public transportation. We can talk about some data, but this idea of bringing together mobility and urban development is our focus. So I would like to thank you for having invited me to take part of this discussion. Martin Taylor and Ricardo have covered this idea very well, because taking into consideration the pandemics, and as Ricardo has said, this much needed consideration of urban planning and housing and the northeast northwest transportation line in London shows the potential that urban mobility has. I'm not going to go on forever because we have a very intense panel, but I would like to thank you for the invitation, and I am available to you to carry on discussing these ideas.
Lo que está haciendo Sao Paulo, ¿no? Para poder atender a estas tendencias que han cambiado
You were
después de la
talking about Sao Paulo and the trends and changes after the pandemic. Thank you very much. I would like to ask Lucila about Buenos Aires. What initiatives have you undertaken so as to be able to try and take into account the changes in trends? And is there anything you could highlight in terms of TOD? Well, like all of us officials who were in office during the pandemic, especially in the transport sector, we faced the challenge of having a toolbox that was not prepared for such an event. So we also had to learn in conjunction with our peers, trying to see how to keep the cities alive and, of course, mobility going as well, in addition to healthcare. And now talking about that, and the pandemic may sound a little obsolete, but let me tell you about what we've been doing since then. On active mobility, we have continued to reinforce our infrastructure, promoting the use of bicycles. We have 300 kilometers of bicycle paths, and we are also including new infrastructure arrangements, such as specific lanes on some roads, and also parking facilities. It's very important for residents as well to be able to have parking space, and our bicycle lane network is also connected to the slums in Buenos Aires, because of course bicycle users are very diverse, and there's also demand there that needs to be met. As I said earlier, as regards active mobility, the concept of the 15-minute city has somehow been devalued, but we work very closely with the public space department of our government, improving pedestrianization and encouraging people to walk, and to try and favor short commutes in different parts of the city. We also have what we call the emergency or green lanes. We talk about the green islets, which is basically combining areas for cars, areas for pedestrians, and also some green bits and patches, so as to allow for some enjoyment and leisure as well. So we're doing this along an avenue in the center of Buenos Aires, 1 kilometer long. So we have made the avenue now a one-way avenue, and we have these 3 lanes we have this linear park, as we call it, and this was a part of the city that used to have a lot of traffic, and we felt there was a lack of leisure opportunities. And, you know, the higher and middle to higher income segments in Buenos Aires have, to a great extent, been moving out to the suburbs further away from town, and the pandemic accelerated this. People rushed to buy cheaper land and looking to build green areas or have the children be able to play in green areas. And that is also a challenge for the city, which needs to come up with a more attractive offer in order for the city not to be left behind and to offer some of what people are looking for in the suburbs. So trying to create these green areas on central streets has to do with trying to offer better living conditions and also trying to improve what we can offer in terms of education, culture, social, healthcare services. But we can also offer more and better public space for our people. And last but not least, this is not strictly transport related. I don't want to be technically inaccurate, but for transport purposes, the retrofitting and conversion of the city center of Buenos Aires is very important. That's where we have most of the infrastructure centralized. All subway lines go into the city center, all buses, the trains, you know, the bicycle lanes. We have invested a lot in the city center. And of course, the transformation process launched by the mayor's office is very important. And we believe that the strategy is aimed at mixed uses, and we want also young people to consider the possibility of living in areas that offer very good accessibility in addition to great culture, social, and business opportunities, in addition to industry and service that is still available in the city center. And also buildings, whole buildings that used to be office use are being turned into homes through government support, subsidies, lower taxes, and gradually this is starting to yield results. But we know that this is a slow process, and even today, you can go at 10 a.m. to the city center, which back in the day was full of hustle and bustle, and now you see it's not that much. We still see a lot of buildings that are inactive or shops that have not really recovered their business activity levels because many people that used to come into town are no longer going. But we think that in the medium term, the city center will be different. And we are putting a lot of energy into that as government through our policy making, also to identify the opportunities for transformation.
Thank you, Lucila. You were telling us about everything that you have been doing in Buenos Aires, and also you talked about the challenges that are important. These are challenges faced by other cities in the world. If we think about the sprawl in the United States and many big cities and how they have tried to take action and how hard it is to get people to go back to the city center. And also you talked about the importance of the younger generations. They want to live close to where they work. So with this, I wanted to include Ricardo in this conversation. Ricardo, here there's a question having to do with Santiago. We saw this for Sao Paulo and Buenos Aires too. So what did Santiago do to be able to deal with these changes, with the sprawl, with extension of the city with people moving further out of the cities. So what did you do in terms of urban mobility? Was there any change in the arrangements for public transportation? Well, just recently, especially in this municipality out in the northern part of the city, Nampa, where they have built a lot of new housing. Just recently, the integrated public transportation system was extended. So we have an extended system and we have a VIP card, and that way you can ride on both the metro and the bus and do transfers. And that system did not reach this new area, but now that the area has grown so much, it was urgently needed to provide transportation to reach the area. So the integrated public transportation system was extended into the area. Now, what we have done, because the problem we have in Santiago is the paradigm of the unplanned city, and that goes back to the times of the dictatorship, the idea that here markets could do whatever they wanted, and that governments were not included in that decision making. And we know that doesn't work. And now what is happening is the public sector is trying to deal with these legacy problems of spontaneous generation of development, where people built wherever they thought it was the most attractive. But basically, I think that the vision should not be reactive. We should be preventive. We should be planning as we look forward. And that is what is happening in first world cities, right? In more developed countries. So there is a clear intention saying, okay, we're going to build this metro line, this line, and we're going to generate development of housing. But here it's the other way around, because houses are built and then the state comes behind the building process trying to provide a mobility solution. Thank you, Ricardo. In terms of planning, then, here I have a question for Martin. Martin, when you were planning these new lines, when you were thinking of these new stations, how did you deal with gentrification? That's a question we have in the chat.
Yes, that's a great question, and it is a real problem, because we find that in areas where we're looking to improve public transport accessibility levels, that successfully creates an uplift in land value that then distorts the demographics of the people that can successfully live there. So it's not just a transport challenge, but it's an overall city challenge. The real hope is that we can spread the investment and improvement required across all of those opportunity areas that I showed on the map at the start of my presentation, such that gentrification and improvement isn't only focused in one area, and that you're trying to improve the whole city. Our focus moving forward, partly because of that, and also due to the restrictions on the amount of funding available, is to really consider the role of the bus network in London. So the metro is fantastic, but it can only go a small number of places. So we have a target that everyone in London is no more than 400 meters away from a bus stop, so that the bus network is accessible for them. We have targets to improve the speed of those buses and the quality of them, to make sure that the bus network provides the backbone to the public transport system, irrespective of how gentrified an area is or not. So it's quite hard to tackle that, because land value, as I said, comes with transport improvements, but it's important to look beyond those landmark improvements and make sure that we're providing a good service to all areas of the city.
Muchas gracias, Martín. Y veo, bueno, María Camila ya apareció en pantalla, entonces le voy a hacer una
I see
última
that Maria Camila is back on the screen, but I have one final question, and it is for both Jose and Lucila. What are we missing in our cities to be able to implement a transit-oriented development, TOD? Well, in the case of Buenos Aires at the metropolitan area, what we need is a land use policy so we can do transit-oriented development. And that in order to deal with the problems that disorderly growth is creating. It is affecting mobility and also the quality of life. So the metropolitan land use, some guidelines would be essential. Thank you, Lucila. Jose?
I could mention that in Sao Paulo, in our urban development plan, we've already have a development guided by transport in the plan. And when we designed it and the review done about 2 months ago, we determined what are the lines, the transport lines, where the incentives to the development of housing is larger than outside those lines. So we are working towards an urban development that will be guided by transportation. As I said, the challenge now is to see what it is that urban development means, how to get the housings nearer transport. And that will not be determined only by the transport lines, but by active mobility, collective or public transportation. In Sao Paulo, our challenges optimize our transportation network that we already have and that one that will be implemented when we have a sustainable urban development.
Planificación integrada de uso de suelo.
Once again, we get into integrated transportation and urban development. So I wanted to thank all of the panelists. It has been a pleasure to be with you. And I wanted to thank Maria Camila and the Division for Urban Development and Housing. I thank them for their invitation. So Maria Camila, you have the floor. Thank you, Agustina. We have had a very interesting conversation this morning. It's been a pleasure hearing from all of you. And I merely wanted to say that the presentations will be available. You can download them in the chat, the presentations that we had today. And I think that the most important thing is to thank everyone. I wanted to thank all of the panelists who were with us today. We had a great conversation, and that has been the case of all of our Wednesday webinars. We have talked about opportunities, associated challenges with better coordinating urban development and mobility. I think that we have looked at different financing alternatives, things that have been innovative and have helped to implement transit-oriented development. Today, it was great to have this conversation on how we can improve trends in travel patterns and also land use, things that have been done in the different cities. It was great to hear from Ricardo, from Lucila. It has been great to hear about land use. In Santiago, we saw the decentralization. I wanted to thank Martin Taylor for sharing with us the way in which London has done its transit-oriented development. It was interesting to hear how they did the Northern Extension projects all the way up to Battersea and Northern Elm. So this is a great example for us in Latin America and the Caribbean. And lastly, I wanted to thank our cities. I wanted to thank Jose Armenio and Lucila for this very interesting conversation. Today's conversation helps us better understand the challenges that you have grappled with to promote active mobility. Also doing climate agency. That is something that we heard about from Buenos Aires and Sao Paulo. That helps us realize that in many of our cities, we share common problems, and we have to put that on the table to discuss those problems to come up with potential solutions. And I wanted to thank you, Agostina, for moderating today's webinar. Thank you for all of the work that you did in the Transportation Division. Thank you for being with us over these 3 weeks. Perhaps I do have a couple of questions that I would like to ask all of you. And here, this is with a view to the future. We're thinking about what we should do next. We know that we have had keen interest in this series. So here with the Mentimeter, we would like to ask you, what development issues do you think we need to tackle for the future? What do we need to discuss? That would help us understand what the challenges are or what you found missing from this 3 webinar series. E-bikes, high-level densification, urban cycling. So you can scan the QR code and that way you can answer. So what do you think is lacking or what would be of interest to continue our conversation? And in the chat, we will be sharing with you another question so that we can explore the quality of what we presented today. How happy are you with today's webinar? We're not going to ask you the question here, but if you do have 1 minute, please do fill out that survey. So lastly, I want to thank all of you for being with us today. Thank you for having participated in this series. And the next series will be Climate Action, and that will be held on September the 20th. So thank you, Agostina. And I also wanted to thank our panelists today. Thank you.
Gracias.